everyone, Torvald here again with another story from the good old days. And in this case, this is from the good old days. Because I'm going way back on this one. You see, the current year is 2021. And I'm going back to 1981, which is when I first became associated with the Society for Creative Anachronism. So I am now going into my 40th year, 4 decades. Wow, that's a long time. So to kind of set this up, we're going to go back just a little bit further than 1981. You see, because all throughout school, I was always interested in history. History was my best subject. Math was my worst, followed by English. But history was my best subject. And not only was I into history, I was also heavily into mythology. And basically just about all of them. You know, Chinese mythology, Japanese mythology, Greek mythology, Roman mythology, and of course, yes, Norse mythology. In fact, in a couple of the schools that I was in, once I got to junior high and high school, classical mythology was a class you could take, and I certainly did. In addition to that, though, I was also heavily into reading fantasy novels. And yeah, I cannot actually remember how far back it was that I read The Hobbit for the first time, and The Lord of the Rings, but I read all sorts of other fantasy books that I could get my hands on, and like many other adolescent boys at the time, yes, I know some girls probably read these too, but the target audience for these novels was teenage boys, and that I am, of course, talking about the Gore books by John Norman. I had them all. I read them all the way up to like book number 22 or something like that. My favorite, though, was the book called Marauders of Gore. I think that's book number 8. And why? Because it was about Vikings. They had Vikings there. And so I was always interested in that kind of stuff. And then around 1978, my parents gave me the starter box set to Dungeons and Dragons. Yep. And they came to regret that later on. Here I am now, 57 years old, and I still play Dungeons and Dragons. But at any rate, at the time I was living, when my mom gave that to me, I was living in Washington State. My father and mother had both been in the Navy, and when they got out, my father had a couple of different jobs and then got into the civil service, working in the shipyards. And at that time, we were living in Port Orchard, right across from Bremerton, where the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard was. And he got a transfer down to Mare Island in Vallejo, California. We moved down to Napa first and then out to American Canyon, which is kind of halfway between Napa and Vallejo. And I went to Napa High School. Now, of course, I'm brand new. I went to Napa High School as a senior. All right. I had already gone through my first 2 years of high school up in Washington, and I had my own group of friends up there and friends that I played Dungeons and Dragons with. And I get down to California and I'm in a high school and everybody's kind of assuming that I'm a freshman or a sophomore when I'm actually a senior. Led to a few fights along the way. But I started looking around for a new gaming group. I wanted to keep playing Dungeons and Dragons. There had to be somebody down there that played. And I ran into a guy named Brian Buchanan. And Brian started to tell me about this group. And at first, with the way he's describing it, I'm thinking live Dungeons and Dragons. You know, what is now called LARP. LARP actually didn't exist back then, or if it did, it was in its very, very earliest stages. And yeah, we can get into that big argument about whether or not the SCA is LARP or not. I mean, if you take the actual words that LARP stands for, live action role play, well then yeah, the SCA is live action role playing, except that it's history based, whereas what we all think of as LARP is fantasy based. And if LARP had been around at the time, it had actually been a big thing at the time, there's a chance that I could have gotten involved with it, but that's what I thought Brian was describing to me. So when he took me to my first meeting, and I can't remember if that was an actual Shire meeting or if it was a fighter practice, and I found out that it was history based, and of course I was a history nerd in addition to all the rest of this, and so I really got into it. I really dug it. And started going to fighter practices. And I was fortunate where I ended up starting in Napa, because the main fighter for the local group was a guy named Joffrey of Griffinhold. And Joffrey was a fencing instructor. All right, he taught fencing at the local community college. And I believe he was at that time working also at Mare Island. He eventually went on to become a teacher in the Vallejo Unified School District until just recently when he retired. So at any rate, I not only had a guy that knew how to fence and knew how to do heavy combat, because he was the main heavy combat guy in the group, but he was also a teacher as a profession, and so he knew how to teach you. So our fighter practices all included fencing as well as heavy combat. Oftentimes we would start off with fencing to kind of warm up and get ready, and then we would go to the heavy. But there were plenty of times we did the heavy first and then got unsuited and moved on into doing fencing. But it was always part of what we did. And I learned a lot about movement and lines of attack angles from him. So that was my early education into the SCA. Now, my parents, as I had mentioned, had been a little unhappy with how fanatic I had gotten into Dungeons and Dragons. And now they were even a little more concerned when they started hearing me trying to describe what this new group that I was getting involved with was like. And so finally, Joffrey and his wife came over to meet my parents, and they brought with them their photo albums, and they showed them exactly what the group was about. That it wasn't just about fighting, that it was about all aspects of the Middle Ages. And also they started, of course, talking about the fighting, because that was what I was talking about the most, was the fighting part. And Joffrey went on to explain that people were not just allowed to jump out there and start swinging, that we had to go through training, and then after training we had to get authorized to demonstrate that we were safe, that we were not going to cause an injury to each other. And he moved on into the armor standards that we had, the things that you had to wear to maintain safety. And so basically kind of alleviated a lot of my parents' worries. And they liked the fact of how old he was and the fact that he was a teacher. And again, I'm pretty sure he was working at Mare Island at the time, which was where my dad was working. So the two of them hit it off like that right away. So they gave their blessing. So I got involved with what was going on. Go to fighter practice every Sunday. And for the most part, did loaner gear. Started working on getting my own kit together. So to give you a kind of an idea here, if you don't know the SCA, armor standards. Armor standards were minimum. You had to wear rigid protection on your knees and your elbows. You had to wear a kidney belt to protect your kidneys and your short ribs. Male, you wore a cup. Female, you wore some other type of groin protection. You had to wear a gorget, neck protection, and you had to wear a helmet. And the helmet had to be made out of steel, and it had to be of a certain thickness, and it had to have full face protection, and you had to have hand protection, which for most of us was hockey gloves at the time. Very few people had gauntlets, And basket hilts were unheard of. They didn't really come into play until a number of years later. And that was the minimums, you know. So the weekend after, Joffrey and his wife came and talked to my parents and showed them everything. I'm at fighter practice on Sunday, and I'm fighting my friend Gregory Falconhart, new friend that I had made in the local group. And we mixed it up. I legged him. He drops down to his knees. For those who don't understand SCA combat, that means I hit him in the leg with a strong enough blow that he had to count that as a wound. And if you are wounded in the leg, you have to drop down to your knees, and that simulates that you have lost the ability to have a lot of movement and maneuverability, and gives your opponent an advantage. So I hit him in the leg, he drops down to his knees, I move in, and I throw a blow at his head, and he throws a cross shot over his head, and wham, hit me right there. Now I just talked about the minimums. You didn't talk about the recommended pieces of armor. In addition to the mandatory pieces that I mentioned, they recommend that you wear body armor of some kind, other than just the kidney belt. They recommend that you wear things to cover the front of your shins. Nobody likes getting whacked across the shins with a rattan stick, believe me. And wear something on your thigh. Honestly, that was something I didn't wear for quite some time. It took a while before I finally got around to making thigh protection. And wear something on your shoulders. That's a joint, so that's kind of nasty to get popped on. And then, of course, for upper arm protection here, you know, they recommend something up there. And what is the thing that I just now have gotten to mentioning? Forearm protection. They're called VAM braces. Recommended. I wasn't wearing one. Wham! Hit me right there. So, bam! Ow! Okay. Ooh. Ow. Are you okay? Yeah, I'm okay, but, you know, ow. I think I'm kind of done for the day. Ow. Boy, that hurts. Okay. That smarts. All right. So I stop, get out of my gear. We take a look at my arm. Joffrey comes over, takes a look at my arm. There's a bit of a bang right there, of course, and it's starting to swell a little bit. And of course it hurts, but I mean, come on, I got hit full force by a piece of rattan on my arm. So I hang around for another half hour, you know, as fighter practice keeps going on. Mostly I'm just watching and helping to marshal, keep an eye out for anything. And then I drive home. Now the car I was driving at the time had power steering, so as I'm driving home, ouch, ouch. Every time I turned my wrist, it hurt. So it was ouch, ouch, okay, use the left arm. And fortunately, the vehicle's also an automatic, so I'm not having to try to shift anything. And I get home, and I put some ice on it, you know. Didn't really mention much to my mom about it, just that I got banged on the arm and I was putting some ice on it. But, you know, it just kept aching and hurting every time I turned my wrist, every time I flexed my fingers. And my mom finally decided to take me to the emergency room and have them take an x-ray. So she and I are sitting in the examination room waiting for the doctor, and he comes back in and he takes the x-ray and he sticks it up on the light board and he turns it on, and I'm looking at it and I go, it's broke. Because sure enough, you can see right there, the bone is bowed like this with a very strong angular problem and a little gap down here where the two pieces came together. And I'm just sitting there looking at it, you know, with this look on my face. And the doctor says, congratulations. And he sticks out his right hand, and I stick out my right hand, and he grabs me by the wrist and, oh! Yeah, you know, he wanted to make sure I didn't have time to realize what he was doing and tense up, so that was how he set the bone. Now they put me in a splint. They didn't cast me right away. And I ended up missing a whole week of school before they put a cast on it. So the first event that I can actually remember attending, you know, up till now it's been all fighter practices and maybe a Shire meeting at some point. but the first recollection I have of an actual event is the Shire of Vinhold's All Hallows or Halloween party. And it was held at a rec center downtown Napa, right at the center of town. And even back then, I was a storyteller. You know, I'm sitting on a bench against the wall and I'm telling Norse myth stories. And there was a young woman sitting next to me to my right. Her name is Rhiannon, Sonia. Hi, Sonia. And as you've noticed, when I'm telling stories, I gesture a lot, move around a fair amount. And so I would be telling the story, and then I would do this, and she would grab my arm and put it down. And then I would keep it down here, and then I do this. And then she would grab my arm and put it down. So I can bash her in the head with it. You know, down, Robert, my real name. At that point, I really hadn't quite settled on what my SCA name was going to be. So most everybody was just calling me by my regular first name. And we still joke about that to this day. She's a very good friend of mine, one of my oldest friends. And so that was how it all started. That is going all the way back to the beginning. So this is my anniversary story.